Colin, in really trying to understand the nature of reality throughout my life, I have been always fascinated with metaphysics, but to many people, metaphysics can mean the occult, or it can mean some absurd argument from Middle Age philosophy about angels dancing on the head of a pin. But as a well-known philosopher who has used metaphysics to really discern important problems, I'd like to understand how metaphysics can really help us understand what reality is.
Well, metaphysics is really just a broad description of reality. Take a science like physics or biology. It'll tell you what kinds of things there are. So that the physicist will tell you which kind of particles there are, whether there are fields in addition to matter, and so on. A biologist will tell you what kinds of entities there are, what kind of species, what kind of organs, cells, and so on and so on. A metaphysician is doing the same kind of thing, but on a much broader scale. So a metaphysician is wanting to know, what are the basic kind of things that the world contains? Now, traditionally, there have been three. There's been the material world, there's been the mental world, and there's been the abstract world. The abstract world is the world of numbers, propositions, theories, meanings, and perhaps, and so on, logic. The formal sciences will deal with that part of the world. So many metaphysicians have taken their start from the idea that there are these three basic categories. So we can take our concepts of the world, you can slot them all into these three categories. Now, once you've made that tripartite distinction, questions arise. Which of these is the more fundamental category? Is each of those really a category of existing entity? So people called the Platonists about mathematics think that mathematical entities like numbers really exist, but they're outside space and time, and they're not mental. They're another kind of entity altogether. The anti-Platonists, or sometimes called the nominalists, believe that there are no such Platonic entities outside space and time. There are only material entities and mental entities. So you get that kind of dispute. Then you look at the mental entities and the material entities. The idealists think that the mental entities are basic.
Right.
And sometimes they think there are only mental entities, or sometimes they think that the so-called material entities are all reducible to the mental entities. That's Berkeley idealism. And the materialists are people who believe that there are only the material entities, and either the others are either reducible to that or they don't exist. And then you get the people who think all of these categories exist. So metaphysics, that's a very classic example of a metaphysical question. Does reality divide into these three groups? And if so, how are they related to each other?
In today's world, the majority of scientists would listen to that and say, yes, that all was true. But now that science has given us our understanding of reality, it really is no longer relevant because only the physical world is really real. And so that's what the real world is, and all the other conversation is really ancient history.
Well, there would be two kinds of objections, wouldn't there, to that position? One would be, if you say only the material world is real, then you must suppose that the mental world is unreal. So then you must suppose that
or derived from the physical world.
Or derived, but that raises another metaphysical question, you see. If it's derived, what's the nature of the derivation? How does this work? How can you show the derivation works? How can you defend the derivation? But there's another front, which is, well, what about the abstract world? So some mathematicians have been insisting recently that, you need to take a more Platonist view of mathematics, and so there is more than the material world.
That's true.
There's the mathematical world too. So that's one kind of metaphysical question. But there are other metaphysical questions a bit more specific, like what's causality? The scientist uses the idea of causality in ordinary scientific context, but if you ask, give an analysis of causality, what does it involve? Does it involve necessary connections? Does it just involve constant conjunctions? You get into lots of debates about that. It's quite difficult. Another metaphysical question is, do entities exist through time? Or should we only suppose that there are events in the universe which are causally connected to each other? So Russell, famous philosopher Bertrand Russell, he advocated the view that there are no substances in the world, there are no individuals that persist through time. There are just events which are causally connected to other events. So he had a metaphysics of events or processes. Metaphysics.
Is that a distinction without a difference, or is there a real difference there?
Well, there would be a difference if on the process metaphysics you would deny that any entities exist over time. So our ordinary ways of talking, when I say, oh, you're the same person, I'm seeing you again, there is no you that I'm seeing again. I'm not sitting on the same chair ever again, because there is no chair that persists over time on that view of things. That's a more eliminativist view. There's a view also in metaphysics which is a reductive view, where you say, I do think there are entities which exist over time, but all that involves are processes and their causal relations. There's nothing more to it than that. And then you've got to go into metaphysical questions about whether that reduction really works.
The charge is made that metaphysics in specific, even philosophy in general, really doesn't make progress, certainly as compared to science, that it's intellectually static, if not stagnant. And it's the same ideas, maybe more sophisticatedly written and said in elegant words, but it's really churning the same stuff over and over again. Progress is not made.
Yeah. Well, I think there's some truth in that. If you compare philosophy to science, certainly there's not been the same kind of progress. We've not made these startling discoveries in philosophy which have been established to everybody's satisfaction. Now, the question is that a criticism of philosophy? It doesn't follow, you see, from admitting there is this difference, that that's a criticism. I'll give you a very straightforward argument for that. Has arithmetic made any progress since the ancient Greeks? Well, no. Why is that? Because they sorted it all out long ago. It didn't need to make any progress. Yeah. So some aspects of philosophy were quickly resolved. They don't need to make any progress. It's been clarified. Others, there is no progress of that kind. Now, again, is that how bad is that? Or do we have a misleading conception of what progress would be? Has our moral thought made progress? Some people have argued, I think not unreasonably, that the moral thinking of Plato and Aristotle was superior to the moral thinking of subsequent thinkers. I think you can make a good case for that. Does that mean that means that moral thinking is not worthwhile? No, it's just the nature of the subject that it doesn't change in the way science changes. It's not an empirical science. Empirical science gets new information. So lots of things don't change. It's not to their discredit. It can sometimes be to their credit. Now, there's a further aspect of this, which is it may be that if we ask what's the reason that we don't make the kind of progress we do in metaphysics or in philosophy, there may be specific reasons for that. So I myself think that at least some questions in philosophy don't make progress because they test our limits of knowledge. So we're running up against the limits of our understanding of the world, which we don't in science, at least in normal science we don't. So some problems in metaphysics, like the mind-body problem, or the problem of free will, or the problem of the self, these problems seem to me to reflect our inability to conceptualize the worlds in ways that enable us to produce good theories of these things.
But if that's true, that's a very useful contribution, because it defines the limits of our knowledge.
Yes,
if that's true.
And that would be useful to know.
Yes.
First of all, it would be interesting to know if that was the case, and also it would prevent us from, bashing our heads up against walls that won't come down.
There was a whole school, of course, logical positivism, that would criticize the philosophy, much of philosophy, as saying that the questions themselves are pseudo-questions, so they really don't have any. They sound like they have substance, but when you dig down, there's nothing there.
Yeah. Well, there are lots of problems with logical positivism. I mean, one of the main ones being it refutes itself, because the principle of verification is not itself a verifiable principle. Right. It's a piece of a priori philosophy. And so it's meaningless according to the doctrines of logical positivism. Yeah, yeah. So logical positivism is meaningless according to logical positivism. But the problem in general with that approach is there may be some problems which are pseudo-problems. It's not like every problem we can put into words is a well-formed problem, and we may discuss later some problems where that's not so. But for many problems in philosophy, they are perfectly well-formed and perfectly understandable. So the question I was mentioning earlier, do objects persist through time? It seems a perfectly well-formed problem. We know what we mean by saying it. We know what it would mean for it to be true or not true. So it doesn't seem like it's something which we just can't make any sense of. And there are other problems, problems about the nature of necessity, for example. What is necessity? When we say that something is a necessary proposition, what's the analysis of that? Is all necessity something which arises from language, or do some necessities belong to the world? Is there a difference between the necessities of empirical laws and the necessities of mathematics or logic? These are questions, they're perfectly understandable questions. They're not nonsensical questions. If a philosopher was very hung up on the question, I don't know whether the number 2 is red or blue, then you'd say that's not a well-formed question. You've made a category mistake in the terminology. But most metaphysical questions that serious people have thought about are not category mistakes. They're perfectly well-formed questions which you can't answer by science. But lots of questions can't be answered by science.
But even
ethics, for example.
even in philosophy and metaphysics, if you can't answer these questions, it still may be very useful because it defines what the nature of reality is and where the boundaries are
Right.
against which we
Yes.
can't push further.
Yes, and it can also articulate the options that we have, and it opens up our thoughts to realizing the world is not as simple as we think. Things are not as straightforward. That's a liberation to most people. When I'm teaching students, they're quite liberated when they suddenly realize things are not as straightforward as they always supposed. There's a sense of wonder, there's a sense of modesty. It's good to have that openness that results from realizing not all questions can be answered by consulting a textbook.